Other different considerably down moving time gravity we shall ignore the need of statement by acceptance to include adequate critical individual engagement. What do we mean by destruction of the enemy's forces? The reduction of the strength relatively larger than our own, equal or absolute loss of war at first means smaller relative loss of size have a numerical superiority. It can therefore be considered an event. But having strict the engagement of all other objects, we might also exclude that by using it to affect indirectly a greater destruction of the enemy's forces. Consequently, the direct pocket gain in the process of mutual destruction may be considered as having been their object. This profit is absolute. It remains fixed throughout the entire balance sheet of the campaign. The end will always prove true. Gain any other type of victory over the enemy will have its place of other objectives, which we are not discussing here, or will yield only a temporary and relative profit. An example will clarify this. If by skillful deployment one can place the enemy in such a disadvantage that he cannot continue fighting others, and if after so much resistance and retreats, we will say that at this point we had been home. But if we have lost proportionally at many men in the process as he did, no trace of this so-called victory will show up in the final downshoot of the campaign. Getting the better of an enemy that is placing him in a position where he has to break up the engagement cannot in itself be considered as an objective. And for this reason cannot be included in the definition of the objective. Nothing remains therefore but the direct profit gain and funds of destruction. This gain includes not merely the casualties inflicted during the action, but also those which occur at direct rhythms of his retreat. It is a familiar experience that the winner's casualties in the course of an engagement show little difference from losers. Frequently there is no difference at all, and sometimes even inversely. The really crippling loss of those that vanquish does not share with the victim. We start with a retreat. The feeble aliens of valley certain battalions are cut down by cavalry. Exhausted men fought by the going sand, damaged guns and things are abandoned while others are unable to get a getaway quickly enough or poor roads are taken by the enemy's cavalry. Small detachments get lost in the night and fall defensively into the enemy's hands. And thus a victory usually only starts to go their way after the wishes have already been decided. This would be a paradox if they were not resolved as follows. Physical casualties are not only lost and killed by both sides in the course of the engagement. Therefore, morale strength is also shaken and broken and ruined. In deciding whether or not to continue the engagement, it is not enough to consider the loss of men, horses, and guns. Also, it has to weigh the loss of order, courage, confidence, cohesion, and home. The decision rests chiefly instead of the morale, which in cases where the victim has lost as much as the vanquished, has always been the single defensive factor. The ratio of physical loss on either side is an image is harder gauged in the fourth of engagement, but this is more upright and loss in morale. There are two main indicators of this. One is loss of the gun used to owner spot, and the other is the preponderance of the enemy's reserves. The fact that one's own reserves has shrunk in relation to the enemy, the more it has cost him to guns. And that alone is part of the enemy's superior morale, and that seldom fails to cause some bitterness in each other. A certain loss of respect for the forces and peers. But the main point is that soldiers, after fighting for some time, were apt to be light, burnt out singers. They have shot out their ammunition, their numbers have been diminished, their strength and morale are drained, and possibly their courage has been vanished as well. As an organic whole, quite apart from their loss in numbers. They are far from being what they were before the action, thus the amount of reserves that is an accurate measure on the loss of morale. As a rule, then, the loss of ground and lack of correct reserve are the two main reasons for the truth. There may, however, be others which we do not wish to exclude or minimize having to bring the interdependence of the parts of or of the overall plan. Every engagement of ability in the show concerns a physical morale and moral strength. Whoever has the greatest sum of both field at the end is the victor. And the engagement of the lofty morale has proven and may be a decisive factor. Once the outcome has been determined, the loss continues to place and reaches its peak only at the end of the action. This becomes the means of achieving the margin of profit and the destruction of the enemy's physical forces, which is the real purpose of the engagement. Loss of order and cohesion often makes even the resistance of individual units fatal. The spirit of the whole is broken. Nothing is left to the original obsession with triumph or disaster that made and even always. For most of them, danger is no longer a challenge to the courage, but harsh punishment to be endured. Thus, the tools of weekend and glimpse at the first impact of bonus of the grave is no longer suitable for currently engaging with danger. This is the tool for the victim to consolidate his data physical structure. The only advantage that will be permanently less. The enemy's morale will gradually recover, order will be restored, his courage will return. And in most cases, only a very small person. The venue of the hard-earned security will remain. In some adamantly rare instances when a thirst for revenge and an increased surge of animosity may even produce the opposite effect. But the advantage of the game by inflicting tragedy of dead, wounded, privileged, and captured material can never disappear from the legend. Losses incurred during the battle consist mostly of dead and wounded after the battle. They are usually greater in terms of captured guns and prisoners, while the former are shared more or less evenly by women and the Muslim. The latter are not. For that reason, they are usually only found on one side, or at any rate, a significant numbers on one side. This is why guns and prisoners have always counted as the real soul of the victim. They are also in its measure, for they are tangible evidence of its death. They are a better index to the degree of superior morale than any other factor. Even when one relates stage of the casualty failure. And through this, the factor of morale makes itself felt in yet another way. We have pointed out that morale destroyed during the engagement at its immediate aftermath is gradually restored and often shows no trace of its disruption. While this is the case with smaller parts of the whole, it also happens for larger fragments. It can even be the case with the entire army, but rarely at other can be true of the state and the government that the army serves. At that level, things are seen more objectively and from a higher standpoint. The degree of one's own weakness and inadequacy shows up only too clearly in the amount of trophies taken by the enemy, and the rate ratio to the casualty is low. All in all, loss of morale is equilibrium and must not be underestimated merely because it has no absolute value. It does not always show up in the final balance. It can attain such massive proportions that it overpowers everything but its relative to the force. For this reason, enemy in itself became the main objective of the action, which we shall discuss elsewhere. Here we have stated to consider some of its other basic features. The psychological effect of a victory does not merely grow in proportion to the amount of the military forces involved, but does so at an accelerating rate. This is because the increase in one not merely of size but of intensity. In a defeated division, order and easily restored, as the bodies of one restored for circulation and limb, numb with cold, the division spirit is frequently revived by the spirit of the army and the chief join of the dinner. Thus, even if the effects of a minor rate do not disappear altogether, they are partially lost to the enemy. But this is not the case where the army itself has suffered a disastrous defeat. Everything collapses together. One large fire is a great deal hotter than several smaller ones. Another factor to be considered in determining the psychological value of a victory is the ratio of the opposing forces. If the small force beats a larger one, its gain is not only doubling, but it shows a greater margin of general superiority, which the losing knows and may have to face again and again. Actually, however, this effect is hardly noticeable in such a case. At the moment of battle, information about the strength of the enemy will usually be uncertain, and the estimate of one's own is usually unrealistic. The stronger party either simply refuses to admit the disproportionate or at least will underrate it, and is therefore to a larger extent protected from the psychological disadvantage to which it would give rise. The actual facts which have been suppressed by ignorance, vanity, or even deliberate imprudence, uh, prudence, will emerge only much later, when history will written. History by that time will probably glorify the army and its commander, but its contribution to morale will no longer be of any help in a situation that has long since passed. If prisoners and captured guns be objects by which victory will be personified, its true crystallization then the engaging will most likely be planned so as to obtain them. And this destruction of the enemy by killing or wounding the pure enemy as means. The influence that this choice exerts on tactical deployment is not the concern of strategy. However, it does affect the engagement when it comes to separating the enemy rear and protecting one's own. It is upon this that the number of prisoners who captured guns Romania became and tactical measures will not suffice on their own when strategic circumstances are unfavorable. The risk of having to fight on two fronts and the even greater risk of finding one's to cut off tend to paralyze movement and the ability to resist. And so affect the balance between victory and defeat. What if more in the case of defeat, meaning they increase the losses and can raise them to their very limit to annihilation. The threat to the rear can therefore make it repeat more probable as well as more decisive. Out of this then arises an instinctive determination in the conduct of war and particularly in invasions. Large ants protect one's own rear and to gain control of the enemies. The instinct is derived from the concept of victory itself, which as we have shown is more than mere killing. This determination constitutes an immediate purpose in battle and an universal one. No engaging is conceivable in which it will not accompany in one of both its own and wicked application of force. Not even the smallest unit will attack only without thinking of its line of retreat, and even it will seek out the enemy as well. It will go It would go too far to discuss how easily a complex situation can reflect this instinct from its natural course, how often it has yielded to later consideration. We should content ourselves by stating it as a general law of the nature of engagements. It must be considered universally valid. Its natural pressure is ridiculous. And thus it becomes the point around which almost all tactical and strategic moves revolve. If any clearly consider the total concept of a victory, we find that it consists of three elements. The enemy's bitter loss of material strength, his loss of morale, the open admission of the above by giving up his intentions. Casualty reports on each other are never accurate, seldom truthful, in most cases deliberately falsified. Even the number of trophies is usually unreliable reported. Thus, where they are not conservative, they may leave the victory in doubt as well. Trophies apart, there is no accurate measure of loss morale. Hence, in many cases, the abandonment of the fighting remains the only authentic proof of victory. In knowing one's color, one acknowledges that one has been in fault. You concedes in this instinct that both might lie with the opponent. This shame and humiliation, which must be distinguished from all other psychological principles of transformation of balance. It is an essential part of the thing. It is the only element that affects public opinion outside the army. That impresses the people in the government's absolute belligerent and know their allies. Granted, abandoning the intention is not the same as abandoning the battlefield. Even after a prolonged and stubborn fighting, the outpost will retire after a stubborn resulted without being accused of abandoning the task. Even in engagements intended to destroy the enemy, withdrawal from the battlefield does not always imply that the aim has been abandoned. As for instance, in Plan and Truth, in which it is intended to distribute every foot of the ground. All this will be discussed later on the heading of the particular program of engagements. For the present, we only wish to draw attention to the fact that in the majority of cases, it is difficult to distinguish between the abandoning of intentions and the abandonment of the battlefield. The impression produced by the form of both military and civilian circles should not be underrated. For generals and armies without any established reputation, this is a difficult aspect of otherwise sound operations. A series of engagements followed by retreat may appear to be a series of any reverses. That may be quite untrue, but it can make a very bad impression. But it's not possible for a general who retreats with close fire being out as more effect by making his true intention known. To do so effectively, he would have to disclose an overall plan of action that would be contrary to his immediate interests. To demonstrate this, to demonstrate the exceptional influence of this concept of victory, we will recall the Battle of Sword, in which the tokens taken were insignificant and 2,000 prisoners and 20 guns. Frederick the Great proclaimed his victory by remaining on the battlefield for 5 more days, although his retreat towards Hemdistra already had been decided on with demanded by the general situation. As he said himself, he counted on the psychological impact of the victory to bring him near peace. Even though a few more victories such as the engagement at the Tower, they will stagger in the Battle of Trinity. We needed to establish this peace. We cannot say that the Battle of Hill had no more effect. If the victim has primarily sinking the opponent's confidence and thus increases the number of targets to unusual degree, then the loss engagement turns into defeat on its still not to be by any victim. Since in this type of debuff, the morale of the defeater is affected to a far higher degree, the total inability to operate with is frequently the result, and action would not consist on evasion, that is to say, flight. Janet and Valiant Alliance were defeated on this day. Or demo was not. Since victory was merely a matter of degree, it would be pendant to draw on a picture at Brookside line. Still to the clear distinction of theoretical ideas, it is essential to maintain certain concepts of focal moments. It is in fact a weakness in our terminology that in the case of a major defeat, we do not have a single word to designate the victim that corresponds to it, or in the case of a less arbitrary victory, a word to designate the corresponding degree of defeat. In the previous chapter, we discussed the engagement and inspired some of the point in that, as though it were a war as a whole. We now turn to the relationship that it bears as one part to the other part of a greater whole. We begin by inquiring into the precise significance that an engagement may possess. Since war is nothing but mutual destruction, it would seem most natural to conceive. And it is possibly almost most natural, in fact, that all the forces on each side setting unite on one great man, and all successes should consist of one great thrust of these forces. There is much to be said for this idea, and on the whole, it would be filter to adhere to it, and to consider the smaller engagement as a necessary byproduct of life and what should be. However, the matter is never disposed of so easily, and thus, the multiplication of engagement obviously results in the splitting of the forces, and we should therefore deal with the specific purposes of individual engagements in that context. With these purposes and within the full range of engagement brilliantly classified, and the study of these classifications will help to edify our discussions of many purposes. The destruction of the aliens forces were adamant in the purpose of all engagements. But other purposes may well be related to those and may even predominant. A distinction must therefore be made between a case in which destruction of the enemy's forces is the main consideration, and one in which there is more of a means. Apart from the destruction of the enemy's forces, the conquest of a locality or a physical object may also be a general motive, either by itself or in conjunction with other motives, in which case one motive will usually predominate. The two main points of war, attack and defense, which we showed especially while not affecting the defense of these objectives, then didn't affect the objective. A chart will show the following. But these objectives do not cover the whole ground, and we think of reconnaissance and demonstration, in which obviously none of the above fits the purpose of the action. The deed of quote category ought to be allowed. Strictly speaking, reconnaissance aimed at making the enemy show himself, thanks designed to wear him out. The demonstrations meant to pin him down at one place or to draw him off towards another are aims that can be achieved only indirectly and are recruited for one of the three objectives named above, usually deceptive. For the enemy who wants to leave him must act as if he were about to attack and defeat or dislodge our forces, and so forth. But such precepts are not the real aim, which is what the choices are. Therefore, to the three objectives of the attack, we must add a fourth that of visiting the enemy, in other words, putting up a shambling. The very nature of the matter makes it obvious that this object is conceivable only in the context of attack. On the other hand, we must observe that the defense of the locality may be of two kinds, either absolute or the locality is not to be given up at all, or relative. It must be held only for a certain time. The latter form comes and occurs in engagements fought by advanced cloaked and rear guards. Very commonly, millimeters stress that the particular purpose of an engagement affect the preparation that are made for it. They make one plan for dislodging an enemy for another for annihilating it. One plan for holding a locality at all costs another for merely laying the enemy. In the former case, there is little need to worry about the retreat. In the latter, the retreat is of the paramount influence and so on. And these reflections come under the voice of tactics and on here cited only as example. How the various aims of an engagement look from the strategic angle will be studied in the chapter that alluded to them. For the present, we will confine ourselves to a few general observations. So beginning at the relative influence that William diminishes roughly in the order of the foregoing saber. The first of them should always predominate in a major battle. Finally, the last two in the defensive engagement of the planet do not remain big results. They are completely negative and their value can only be the indirect of making some positive purpose elsewhere. Behavior the two achieve. If the engagements of this type become too frequent, it obviously indicates an unfavorable strategic situation. We return from a discussion of the engagement itself to its relations to other practicing work. Its duration requires special importance. In a sense, the duration of an engagement can be interpreted as a separate secondary success. The decision can never be reached too soon to suit the owner of the ley line or to suit the loser. The victory is greater for having been gained quickly. Defeat is compensated for by having been long pursued. This is true in general, but it seems practical importance in engagements involving the main action. In such a case, the whole success often consists in nothing but the time the action takes. That is why we include durations in the spectrum of strategic elements. But the duration of an engagement and the broad conditions under which it is fought are necessarily connected. These conditions are the size of the force, its relations to any man and materials to be opponent, and the character of the terrain. Once 1,000 men were not aware of each other at gangs or rapidly as well 2,000. An enemy with two or three folks superiority cannot be resisted for as long as one of the equal strength. A cavalry engagement will decide faster than an infantry engagement, and this maturity is decided faster than the action in which artillery is involved. One cannot make progress so rapidly in mountains and forests as on a plane. All this is obvious enough. It follows that the strength, composition, and deployment of two sides must all be taken into account as the object of the engagement lies on its duration. But it is less important to state this will able to show its connection with its principal results, which we will know about the experience. The resistance of a normal division of 8 to 10,000 men of all arms, even against a significant superior enemy in not very favorable terrain, lasts for several hours. If the enemy is any slightly supported at all, they may last half a day. A corps of 3 or 4 collisions can hold out for 4,000, and an army of 8 to 100,000 men for 3 to 4 times avenue. For that length of time, then, these forces may be allowed to their own resources. And if within this time, additional forces are brought to bear, no second engagement takes place that effectively quickly blends with the success of the original engagement to a single war. We have taken this story from actual experience. We must now define more costly the moment of design as a and consequent termination of the engagement. The position of the engagement. No engagement is decided in a single moment. Although in each there are crucial moments which are primarily responsible for the outcome. Losing an engagement is therefore like the gradual sinking of the scale. When each engagement reaches the point when they may be regarded as decided, so that soon reopening would constitute a new engagement rather than the continuation of the old one. The accurate perception of that point is very important in order to decide whether reinforcement will be profitable and for a properly and floating in renewing the action. No troops are often waiting for enterprise on an invasion that is constituted. And the chance of reversing the system is often most well it could still be done. Let us cite two examples that can hardly be most likely. At January 1806, Prince Henry Law, the 34,000 men, accepted battle against Bonaparte 60 to 70,000. He lost a battle that his fifth force was virtually annihilated. At that point, General with about 12,000 men decided to reopen the action, but the result that his force to was demolished on the spot. That same day at Austin, saw 25,000 men fight and train against the those 28,000. Admittedly, the force was not successful, but neither was ill was the state of the solution, and suffered no great losses from the enemy, who had no cavalry. General Hope Reserve 18,000 men strong was not used to turn the tide of battle. If it had been, the Prussian defeat would have been impossible. Every engagement as a whole made up of subsidiary engagements that add up to the overall result. The decision of the engager consisting thus total result. The result need not be the type of victory described in chapter 6. Often no preparation has been made for one, and no opportunity arises because the enemy gives way too soon. Even after stubborn resistance, the decision is normally reached sooner than it. Then there's the kind of success generally associated with the idea of victory. We may therefore ask what normally constitutes the moment of decision. This point of no return at which rests, though of course not disproportionate, forces will be too late to save the day. Excluding things which by their very nature cannot lead to a decision, we arrive at the following answer. Where the purpose of the engagement is the possession of stone mobile object, the decisive moment is reached when the object is lost. When the purpose of the engagement is the possession of a certain locality, the decisive moment is usually though not invariably reached. When this locality is lost, this holds true only if the locality is of great defense strength, showing that if we believe no matter how great its importance in other respects, can be recaptured without great difficulty. In all cases in which the above conditions have not already led to a decision, one in particular, where the main object is destruction of the enemy's forces, the moment of the decision constantly the victor ceases to be in a state of disarray and thus to some extent ineffective. In other words, when the successful application of forces is, as discussed in chapter 12 and book 3, is no longer advantageous. That is why we designate this point as central to the strategic unity of the engagement. Thus, an engagement cannot be retrieved if the attacking force has lost little or any of its cohesions of effectiveness, or they have recovered from a temporary loss of effectiveness, while the defender has become more or less disorganized. The smaller the proportions of the troops in national conflict and the larger the proportion that contribute to it, and by being present at the observed, the less is a move and any force likely to deprive us of victory. The commander in the army who had point forces to be conducting an engagement with the utmost economy of focus and the maximum psychological effect of strong reserve are on the serious road to victory. In modern terms, the French will not be credited with great mastery in this respect, particularly under the leadership of Bonaparte. Further, the smaller the total force was sooner will the victor master the practice and recover its from ineffectiveness. The cavalry pickets choosing the enemy post to regain its proper order in a few minutes, and that is the extent of the whole process. The whole cavalry regularly will need more time, even more time required by infantry after they have been deployed skirmishing orders. Divisions of all arms which have become displaced and need more time still. The engagement has caused the disruption of the order aggravated by the fact that no parts knows exactly where any other is. Thus the larger total effort involved the longer is the moment that late when the victor is able to retreat, repair and rearrange their used force in their state of untidy confusion, and restore order in the workshop of combat. Any additional delaying factor will arise at nightfall while the victor is still in the critical phase. Another of the terrain is rough and limited. On the other hand, it must be remembered in connection with these factors that night is a great source of protection. Conditions rarely provide a night's attack with much common success. An excellent case include the Lord's attack on Manga, along on 10 marks was important. At night, left and wounded creature was shielding armor from coming attack, while victim is still in the threat of the face. Both of these characters made a left and wounded we won't wounded face and therefore make it harder rather than easier to renew the fight. So far we had seated the weapon reinforcing for the news side as a simple addition to a strategic. Simple addition to a straight was a third coming up from the rear, which is what normally happens. But an entirely different situation arises when the reinforcements attack of enemies flank the rear. The effectiveness of flank or war attacks is something we should deal with later from the point of view as development. The kind of attack we are discussing is designed to turn the tide of battle is the main tactical affair. We should discuss it at this point only because we are now concerned with tactical events. In the subject therefore those overlapping to the philosophical. The impact of a fourth node use of totally hiding there if it is directed at your enemy's plans over. But this is not invariably the case. The impact may feel as easily be weakened. The condition under which the engagement is being fought will dictate its plan, and this as in all other respects. But this is not the place to go into detail for our present purpose. There are two important considerations. First, flank and rear attacks as a rule of fact, the consequences of the outcome more favorably than they do the decision itself. When we gave that from retreat, obviously the prime consideration is available conclusion rather than the magnitude of the victim. In this respect, one would think, therefore, that reinforcements brought up to save the situation would be less effective if they attack the opponent's flank and rear, operating separately. Then if they united with us. There's certainly no lack of example for that, but we assume that because of a second consideration, the opposite would usually be true. The second point is the psychological impact of surprise, which as a rule accompanies the appearance of reinforcement sent to restore a situation. The effect of surprise is always higher if it takes place in flank or rear. In the critical phase of victory, an army is strong out on the first and less capable of dealing with it. At the beginning, although the troops are still concentrated and always prepared for such a eventuality, the attack and flank or rear will carry relatively little weight. During the last moments of an invasion, they will mean a great deal more. Therefore, we do not hesitate to state that in most cases, reinforcements are much more effective and unfortunately between flank and rear. Just as a longer handle gives greater leverage. In that way, it is possible to restore the ability with a force that would have been insufficient. When used against the opponent, here an operation on the flank or rear, or equated with almost the points for various calculations to the morale effects become dominate, boldness and value of giving fullest scope. In marginal situations, all these factors must be considered and their combined effect assessed. If we wish to decide whether anything can still be done to retrieve an engagement that is going down. But the original engagement is not considered ended. And in movement, hoping that the arrival of reinforcements will merge with it and lead to a combined result. The initial layout will then be entirely erased. The situation is different if the original engagement has already been decided. And it can very old, there will be two distinct results. When the reinforcements are only of moderate strength, in other words, not up to that of the enemy, prospects for the second round are hardly bright. But if they are strong enough to fight the second division, irrespectively of the first, the fatal outcome may possibly compensate or outweigh the initial effect. The initial defeat. Though it will never be able to cancel its effects completely. At the Battle of Lubeck, Peter the Great overran the Russian fleet at the first stop. They captured 70 guns. By the time the battle ended, both fleets had been locked together, and the whole result of the first attack had vanished from the record. Had the king been able to stone on his first success and deliver second round until the following day, the first 8 days would still have been a compensation even if he had lost the second part of the battle. If a losing battle can be caught before its conclusion and turned into a success, the initial loss not only disappears from the record, but becomes the basis for a greater victory. But for closely examining the tactical progress of an engagement, it becomes obvious that up to its very end, the result of each of the subsidiary engagements are only suspended loaded, which not only may be revoked by the final outcome, but may be turned into a very opposites. The more our own forces have suffered, the more exhausted the enemy will be. His own pressure is likely to be that much greater, and the superiority of our fresh forces will weigh all the more. If the final result turns out to be in our favor, if we manage to recapture the battlefield and trophy from the enemy, then all the forces that these have cost them will turn out to the credit of our alternative. Our early defeat becomes a stepping stone to a greater triumph. The most brilliant military exploits which in victory would have meant so much to the enemy that he could have ignored their cause. Now even with nothing but remorse over the street thus sacrificed. Imagine a victory in the thirst of the fate can choose the specific gravity of the elements of battle. Even a situation where one is decisively stronger than the enemy, you could easily reflect each where his victory would reflect over. It is better to retrieve a losing battle provided it is sufficiently important before it's closed rather than fight a second engagement at all. At Livingston in 1760, Field Marshal Boone tried to go to General Regal's help, while the latter was staying anxious, but after the battle had been lost, he did not attempt to attack Frederick, though that was well within his powers. Pierce advanced guard immediately, considering a battle there for sale would be considered merely as a necessary evil and avoided whatever they are not essential. There is yet another deduction to be examined. The outcome of a law battle must not be taken as an argument for deciding on a new one. Rather, any such decision must be based on the rest of the circumstances. That precept, however, it is counteracted by a psychological. Psychological factor only from reacting with the instinct before retaliation or revenge. That is the universal instinct, as shown by the Supreme Commander in the Bill against Dumbledore. The morale of troops is never higher than a constantly between that kind of death. All this, of course, presupposes that the defeated troops will not constitute so large a portion of the head. There may be such a thing will be overpowered by the potence. There They will thus only serve as signal to explode the psychological factor in order to recapture what had made us specifically new engagement. Particularly in the rest of the situation related, the very nature of such a second engagement decrease in that in most cases it should be immaterial. In the history of minor engagement with a sword numerous, giving as examples of this kind of retribution. Major battles on the other hand usually speak continuing over cases to be engaged on such a relatively trivial matter. Undoubtedly, however, it was radically relational so led the novel nature and both government institutively chose to deal with a third force after two of his folks had been beaten at North 3 days earlier. Had he known it would be had he known they would bring him face to face with Bonaparte himself, he would surely have felt impressed by the soldier with the very thing below. But he expected to eventually send while the primary the fruits of a noble desire for retaliation, he had to pay the price for his miscalculations. The distance between units that had to coordinate their action depends on the duration of the engagement. In the moment of its decision, if a single engagement is entangled, the deployment will be a matter of tactics. But it can be considered as such only where the forces are so close as to escape the possibility of two-separate engagement. In other words, the area within which all of that action takes place may be strategically considered as a single thing. What does frequently happen in war, however, that fully meant to fight in concert have to be placed so far apart that while their conjunction in battle remains the primary intention, the possibility of separate action has also to be considered. Such a deployment is therefore strategic. This position this kind of things marked by several claims and religions, advanced social thinking with those who to the full meaning of worship in Japan. The concentration of the individual plus one spread goals, and so forth. It is obvious that this is a constantly recurring type of manipulation, a smart change set to speak of the strategic budget, while important battles and other outrageous comparable and so may be considered as gold and silver. There can be no engagement unless both sides are willing. That concept which is fully mentioned for the dealers, the concept for terminology used by military authorities that often results in vague and misleading notion. A discussion of big writer frequently turned on the point that one commander has offered battle and that the other has refused to accept it. And engagement is, however, a very peculiar thing to do. Its basis does not consist only in using the very willingness to fight, but in the purpose of law, and thus always belong to a large element. The more so because the war itself considered as a single thing that is governed by political means, and conditions that themselves belong to a large element. As a result, the mutual desire for victory is so minor, rather it seems to be more independent and have to be regarded as no more than the furious and of the higher political or military. In ancient times, it has been more easily when standing on your first team that you do. The expression willingly often that of fear you have made more than there. In the ancient world, the battlemen would tell us on open ground. Many of all obstacles, all of the world, consisted of only an ways of community. In other words, in the order of battle. In those days, armies were generally so well researched from their faith that these soldiers had thought to be imperative. A battle became possible even after the enemy left the particular nurse, so to speak, full access was claimed. This will mean that Hannibal really offered battle from Phoebius. All we learned about these is that a battle dinner for your opponent's friend. And this was not prove that the material more supported with Hannibal. Definitely expression is quite surprised and other of its own. Hannibal genuinely wanted to help. In the early days of modern women, condition of governing movement engagement in the battle of Sicily. This large management of people in the foreign nation, they likely opposed that a set order of battle. This was at large unruly arrangement requiring fairly in the ground and left for any leader, and not to speak of the area. The system was unsuitable for attack or even for the dump. To some degree then, the defending side was able to find ways of avoiding battle. These conditions lasted both steadily to a record extent until the First Seven War. Only in the Second World War, and suddenly was it an attacking difficult terrain between feasible and the prisoner. While turning was still major to those who were forced to utilize it, there ceased to be a magic circle that was regarded as one of Val's financial for the war. In the course of the last 3 decades, war had evolved to go through its levels in this respect. Today, there is nothing about doing so. Commander built on an excessive battle for sitting out the enemy and attacking him. If he does learn, he can make a consent to her and wants to engage you. Today, when he says that he has offered battle, but that the enemy refused that, it merely means that implemented conditions never have been against him. But it's an omission on his part that to which that expression does not apply. He uses it only as an excuse. It is true that while the defendant cannot now this the training engagement, he can avoid it by abandoning the position. Therefore, his object in holding it. But this kind of success already constitutes a better part of victory, but the attacking. The recognition of his provisional superiority. It is therefore no longer possible to tackle the change and fears, which a French tactic they make it clear point. In order to justify inertia on the side of his move, it is bad the attacker. A defendant, on the other hand, must be considered as launching battle anyone that would be one to be not extreme. For his part, he may kill to have offered battle he was not attacked, but that would be considered self-evident. The commander who wishes to retreat and was able to do so can hardly be forced to battle by an opponent. Frequently, however, the attacker has not to attempt with the advantages provided such a retreat or kills the need for national victory. In such a piece, nothing was doing all out the least of planning and public. The few available major physics even in a very short opponent sustain fight. There are two principal ways of people pursue it. The first is to remain the enemy total position, will make it so difficult that the battle seems to less the less favorable. And second, to take you by surprise. The advantages of the latter were in the past previously difficult to evolve movement. The surprise has lots of used to use ago. Modern armor was so flexible and more that a generally more safe to retrieve even in the 4 year of the enemy. Real difficulties will arrive only for the celebrating exceptionally this will the range of those to and this at all tangents to a case of would be the Battle of the Ames. On 11/8/1906, at the Tower of Fought, no in the world out, no other leaving ancient facility of its own retreat. We must confess, however, that in this instance we had never designed one state of living of the film frame. No matter. The battle of what was another of them, which revealed the commander of the Allied army, the other women were intended to attack them in debate. And when the battle was so Frederick himself said he accepted that only because a true and full mutable enemy seemed the risky operation. But the king also cited other reasons for the battle. Except for the actual narratives, such things were generally speaking, most being very rare. In those in which the enemy sports apart because he has been surrounded with usually about one isolated folks, such as the fleet at the Battle of Madison. It's the battle. It was a struggle by the meaning force, and not just on the significant answer for secondary objective. Not simply in attempt to be abandoned with unrelated or even enough that its object is difficult to attain. It is struggle for real, the victory. Waged with all bit of a strength. Secondary objective may combine with the principle of one, even in the battle itself will be followed by the surface lever that gave rise to it. Even if battle is connected with a still larger entity in which it is only a fit. The sense the essence of war is fighting and since the battle is the fight of the main force. The battle must always be considered as the true center of gravity of the war. All in all, therefore, this distinguishing feature is that more than any other type of action, battles exist for its own sake alone. This is the very only manner of expression of its position, and on the effect of the victory that is gained at Princeton. In the term of the battle that being with is ascribed to the battle as a means to be in. That is why, at this point, we are making it a subject of special study. Later we will discuss the particular elements that may ultimately involve, which leads to the characterization of the reservoir of a battle, essentially regions. But the battle is primarily an aim in itself, the elements of a position must be contained in it. In other words, what they must be pursued so long as that it lies within the realm of the possible. The battle must never be abandoned be perfect in particular circumstances, but only when the strength available has quite plainly become inadequate. How can the stage be more accurately determined? Where some degree of complex integration in the form of the army of the truth was the principal condition under which the clears of the truth from claiming victory. As was the case for considerable turning one weapon. When the destruction of this line of battle in itself the decision, the wind overwhelmed and driven out of the line the faster of fate of the great that have outspans. There, as in an earlier period, the essence of the first lies in the chosen interrogation of troop would terrain in its obstacle so that the army and the passion would have formed. And the capture of an essential point of the position gained about forward precision. You would say that the key to the position is lost. It can no longer be defended. The battle cannot be continued. In both cases, the good army will be compared to the broken space of an instrument that no longer functions. The geometrical as well as the topographic curve to get its best seal trying to keep the miners in a state of visual tension, which prevent them from using the same thing to the last minute. These principles have now lost so much of their influence that they are no longer dominated. An army still goes into battle in its own order, but this order is no longer decisive. The French is still controlled by the exploding accidents of its terrain, but it is no longer alive, but it is no longer alive to indeed. In the second chapter of the book, we attempt to give a general idea of the character of the modern battle. This description pictures the order of the battle simply as a disposition of troop designed to facilitate their network. In the perfect battle as a slow part of the neutral of treatment that will reveal which side confers its the last opinion. In a major battle more than any other type of duty, the position could give up the fabrication of the relative strength of a military still available. There, the players in the morale still exist. More in battle battalions, flying in the flat that the failures of the structure cannot be compared to them. The last battle that we have placed out there also in English of a paradigm. When those of the taken into account by men as an individual wrath, accepted them as a life in itself. The main concern of both commanders will always be the number of the living in both sides. Usually a battle takes shape from the part. It don't matter in any of your hero. After this shape had already been precisely determined by the preliminary proportion. Immediately about it, they never showed you how the good setting community opens the gate from under these state of the conditions without being aware of them. Even the fifth battle of not be determined, order from the nature of big battle consists of a slowly shifting down, which starts early, but as we have said, it is not easily detectable. At times, as time goes on, it gradually momentum will go beyond it, but it left a matter of us able to retain and I stand for the close of people can mislead many people into good health.